Over the past few weeks, universities across the United States and around the world have seen some of the largest campus demonstrations in decades. Students have organized sit-ins, encampments, and other forms of protest to express their disapproval of the financial ties their schools have to Israel and ongoing American support for violence in Gaza that has killed countless Palestinians. Casualty figures are difficult to come by, but the last numbers recorded were 34,622 people killed and another 77,867 injured. Although coverage of these events has been less than reliable in traditional media sources, social media is being credited with getting some of the more shocking imagery and stories in front of students and other younger audiences, creating the outrage we're seeing on college campuses. The message from these demonstrators is quite clear, that they do not want their tuition dollars and their tax dollars going towards violence that many in that movement are calling a genocide. The reaction to these demonstrations in the mainstream media has not been great. Some outlets have gone so far to compare it to 1930s Europe.
What you just saw is 2024 in Los Angeles, harkening back to the 1930s in Europe, and I do not say that lightly.
While I'm more than happy to explain how terrible the mainstream media has been on all of this, I felt the urge to see what independent news commentators have been saying. In this case, I took a look at the coverage coming from Tim Pool. As someone who styles himself as a fierce defender of free speech, I thought it would be interesting to see how this supposed principle would hold up when it was coming from protesters on the left facing brutal police crackdowns. Let's set the stage with a look at a video that was uploaded on April 23rd titled, "Biden claims there are good people on both sides," as leftists called to burn Tel Aviv and support Hamas. Pool's coverage in this video is focused on presenting Joe Biden as having some kind of flub for his comments defending both sides of the protest, but I'm not terribly concerned with Tim Pool's 1,000th video going after Joe Biden on spurious grounds. I'm more interested in what he has to say about the student demonstrators specifically.
Even when we do criticize Israel or welcome others to criticize it, it's not enough. It's woke. It's wokeness.
A truly bizarre commentary where he seems to think that leftists and white nationalists, which he calls white identarians, are interchangeable or somehow partnering up.
If you are a white identitarian, anti-Israel, leftist, whatever, these people just don't like Jews.
Being a leftist does not mean hating all Jewish people. In fact, many Jewish people happen to be on the left and consider themselves leftists. But Tim's commentary on all of this isn't just lacking in nuance. It's a deliberate attempt to justify the worst commentary about the student demonstrators while trying to stretch that out to include the left more broadly. Before continuing, though, I have to stop for a moment to address something. There is an actual problem in leftist spaces where harsh criticisms of Israel is often used by people who are anti-Semitic as a cover. It certainly isn't a majority within leftist spaces, not by a long shot, but it is something we on the left do need to be on guard for, especially since when it comes to criticizing Israel, especially in its treatment of the Palestinian people, it is certainly not anti-Semitic, and it's actually a very important part of the fight for human rights. While it would be nice to think that being a leftist would inoculate someone from being anti-Semitic or, for that matter, racist or misogynist or transphobic, that simply isn't the case. But importantly, we don't need people such as Dana Bash or Tim Pool to call this out for us, because these aren't genuine concerns over anti-Semitism. Rather, this is painting entire groups with a broad brush because of the actions of a few to delegitimize an entire movement. Let's go back to Tim Pool's commentary on the demonstrators. He needs his audience to believe these protesters are completely clueless.
22-year-old kid sitting in his dorm, 20-year-old kid playing video games, and his friends are like, "Hey, you want to go down to the camp?" And they're like, "Oh yeah, what's going on?" It's like people like camping on the lawn, like they're protesting. "Oh, cool, let's go check it out." That's it. You see all these people standing around, and it's mostly because they're just like, "Oh, well." They show up, they're hanging out. You can see some of these people have no idea what they're talking about, as I mentioned with that video. And then they're like, "Come on, help protect the encampment." It's like Burning Man. That's what they're doing.
The reason Tim doesn't show us his source for these claims is because it's against the YouTube terms of service to show your asshole on camera. This makes up the bulk of his commentary toward the demonstrators, that they are an unthinking mass of humanity. I did my best looking at several videos to find any kind of evidence to support this claim, but more often than not, he would simply make a statement like this and move on without providing any kind of evidence. The students being a clueless mass is also easily disprovable. it's almost trivial to find videos of demonstrators speaking to the reasons why they've shown up in the first place.
Simple. We don't want to trade in the blood of Palestinians, and that means divestment from all direct and indirect holdings that this university has, whether that be weapons manufacturing, companies that operate illegally in occupied territory, companies that produce information technology for the occupation army. Complete divestment.
Is a student movement being built all around the world, made up of millions of people who are refusing to be complicit in this genocide, with our government's total support for the genocide that is being carried out by the state of Israel.
There's thousands of other students who are just like me but aren't able to graduate because their universities have been destroyed. They aren't able to celebrate because their families have been killed and murdered. And our university that we give our money to is complicit in that.
In contrast, Tim Pool instead chose to highlight this particular demonstrator.
I think the goal is just showing our support for Palestine and demanding that NYU stops. I honestly don't know all of what NYU's doing.
Is there something that NYU's doing?
I really don't know. I'm pretty sure they're... Do you know what NYU's doing? About what? About Israel. Why are we protesting here?
Palestine will be free!
I wish I was more educated. I'm not either. I came from Columbia. I was there up at Columbia and we came down. They said NYU students needed our support.
As we can clearly see, this is a student from Columbia who is not familiar with the specific demands being made at NYU. Rather, she's there to express solidarity with her fellow students. Tim twists this to mean something else.
Because they're not protesting anything.
I know. It
is the cause to latch onto, and bored college kids who are part of a cult come out and do this.
He's obviously lying about what's being said, but he'll endlessly repeat his characterization about what these demonstrators are all like. Of course, this is one of the only times he'll actually show the demonstrators speaking in their own words. The rest of the time, he simply repeats his hypothesis, or he'll speak with examples like this from an entirely different protest.
And I remember I was filming and there was some guy who was chanting, and he was going, abi, dabida stiba dista. He had no idea what he was saying. And I immediately turned the camera and I was like, hey, what were you chanting? And he's like, oh, I'm chanting with the group. And I was like, yeah, what did you say? And he goes, oh, I just, I don't know. He's marching with the group, trying to sound out what they're saying with having no idea what it was.
This anecdote doesn't even meet the very low bar of a video being misrepresented. This is a story we have no way of verifying that we're supposed to take on face value, right after Tim Pool has lied about a video of another protester. Why should we assume this story from a couple of years ago is being remembered accurately when he can't even tell us what was in a video he just saw a few moments ago? Rather than try to make an effort to understand the protesters, Tim has already decided what he thinks the protesters believe and is using that lens to interpret what's being said. And when he can't find a protester to say something vaguely similar to what he needs them to say, he'll just pull out one of these anecdotes, instead of doing something as simple as looking up other interviews protesters have done, or even doing something as simple as going to the Students for Justice in Palestine website to read some of their generic demands. At first, Tim Pool was just looking at these demonstrators in isolation as a group of thoughtless young people, vaguely connected to the left. But now he's starting to tie these demonstrations to previous left-wing ones of the past as some kind of giant communist threat. We see that in the April 29th video titled Far Leftists Attack Alex Stein and Ami Horowitz, Mass Arrests at Communist Gaza University Protests.
Right now, what we're seeing across the country at these universities, they claim is an anti-Israel gathering. However, it's not really. I mean, it kind of is. That's certainly a core tenet and a principal reason for why people are gathering. But if you take a look at the photos, if you take a look at what people are actually protesting for, it is, I don't know, vague communism.
Tim then argues that these demonstrators calling themselves anti-war can't possibly be so because some demonstrators supposedly attacked Alex Stein.
Alex Stein went down to UT Austin and he was asking the people there. They said that they were LGBT for Palestine and things like this. And when he asked them, yes, but in Palestine, in Gaza, you go to prison or you could be killed for being gay. What did they do? They physically attacked him.
Tim Pool didn't show us the video because it looks like this.
Protesting for Palestine, but don't Palestinians throw gay people off roofs?
Hey, sir, can you please leave?
Yeah, no, I'm just going to hang out right here. Can anybody tell me about, did they do any pride parades? Get the out of here. Dude, what are you going to do about it? You guys are all idiots. You guys are transgenders, but you guys aren't even allowed to be in Palestine. I know, but you
Stein wasn't just there to ask questions. He showed up with 2 cameras in a deliberate attempt to antagonize the demonstrators. He's a provocateur, quite clearly, which I suspect is why Tim Pool doesn't show us this video. It's far more useful to say demonstrators are attacking people asking innocent questions, removing all context where we see Stein acting like a complete jerk. And once this claim of violence is manufactured, Tim Pool is then able to free himself from those pesky principles he claims to have. The irony of the Stein stunt is that while he was trying to point out some kind of irony of LGBT people supporting Palestine, this is actually a demonstration of real principles in action. But even looking at the broader picture of the status of LGBT rights within Palestine and how people within that community might face hostility and persecution, that doesn't mean people within the LGBT community globally are okay with seeing Palestinians being slaughtered. As a quick aside though, there are LGBT people within Palestine who a group like this is obviously standing in solidarity with, so there is actually no irony in that case. For Tim Pool, rights seem to be a very reciprocal thing. They aren't some fundamental base rock, but rather only to be respected in others if they respect them in you. It's a very convenient way to jettison your principles.
Lock them up. Send in the cops. Arrest them all. You may be saying, but Tim, you can't abandon the classically liberal principles of free speech. These protesters have every right. Don't care.
There are laws against assault and other forms of violence. If Tim Pool thinks those should be applied, it should be sufficient to silence any particular demonstrator doing that. But to say an entire side in a political debate should be silenced because some people within that group are violent is a dramatic overreaction, especially when the examples of violence he uses are so weak. Another one he brought up in this video was an incident involving Ami Horowitz, which is very similar to the Alex Stein one, in that we see Horowitz being a jerk as he tries to rush into an encampment where he's clearly not welcome.
Man. What are you doing?
It's hard to present yourself as someone being attacked by protesters when you're literally trying to run into their encampment after they've asked you repeatedly to leave. And that by inserting himself there, he was, at the very least, being provocative. The Horowitz case and the Stein case reveal how hard it was to find real examples of assault at these demonstrations during this particular time frame. These are just people trying to provoke a violent response to create a pretext for silencing these demonstrations. In addition to the bogus examples of violence, Tim Pool uses several other bad arguments to try and discredit the demonstrators.
What is the demand of these protests? There isn't one. It's generic, chaotic destruction.
Not understanding or be confused as if these demonstrations are incomprehensible and simply about spreading destruction and chaos. For someone who presents himself as a commentator explaining the news of the day, he is either incapable or unwilling to look past this very superficial and dishonest framing of events.
It is a fundamental obligation we have as citizens of a country that is presiding over this genocide, arming this genocide, and as students at a university that is invested in those same weapons manufacturers and that is partnered with the same apartheid institutions that train that military and develop its technology.
In a video uploaded on April 30th, titled Anti-Israel Riot Take Over Columbia Building, Smash and Barricade Hall Amid Mass Arrest of Leftists, we can see just how poorly equipped Tim Pool is to discuss the philosophy of rights regarding free expression.
I'm not going to defend these people, for which the question arises, but what about their free speech rights, Tim? Your rights can be curtailed through due process. There are mechanisms by which we, as a liberal society, decide you have now forfeited your rights.
Let's pause for a moment and think about that. Rights are often suspended when someone breaks the law. He mentions due process, but what due process is happening here? Where there do appear to be some instances of laws being broken, such as breaking and entering, why would that then mean anyone who shares the same ideological commitments should also have their rights be taken away? That's not how due process works, or at least that's not how it's supposed to work. People are punished for their individual actions, and collective punishment is not supposed to be part of due process. If you think about it, and I'm not sure Tim has, it doesn't make any sense. He then weirdly compares it to capital punishment.
Well, in this country, whether I or anyone else likes it, because I'm not a fan of the death penalty, you actually forfeit your right to life.
Highlighting a way in which the justice system violates people's rights is not a very convincing argument. He doesn't even address the morality of the question, which is the whole point. Describing this as something that currently happens implies that the status quo is an acceptable standard, when capital punishment is something that's very intensely debated and actually not used in many countries. This sort of flat discussion of the way the world currently operates completely dodges the questions of what it means to have a right suspended, when that can or should ever happen, specifically when it comes to the right of free expression. This is the full extent of his philosophical discussion, by the way, arguing for collective punishment and then providing the dreadful capital punishment example. Another argument Tim tries to use is that he knows a guy who was a leftist who said leftists don't really believe in free speech. This is from the video titled "Pro-Palestinian Protestors Says Zionists Don't Deserve to Live," gets banned by Colombia.
And he chuckled and he was just like, you guys are useful idiots. We were demanding the right to say the things we wanted to say, and you marched alongside us. And now that we have that power, we will shut you up.
Yeah.
And I was just like, wow.
Another story from someone that must be true, I guess. And the advantage of Tim Pool's IRL program is that he surrounds himself with people who frequently tell him that he's right. And in many of the videos I watched, I saw very little pushback to anything he said, and in this particular instance, no one even asked Tim to provide a morsel of proof that any of this happened at all. Never mind bringing up the point of how ridiculous it is to generalize the comments from one random guy to the entire left. Ironically, he claims in another video that it's the left doing that.
They're like, this person here is insert quality, therefore all. And it's just like, dude, I'm just so over that.
One of the advantages of Tim Pool having so much airtime to fill is that eventually he'll address criticisms against his point. Although when I say addressed, it's more like he simply acknowledges they exist. Here he is responding to someone pointing out that he shouldn't lump all demonstrators into one monolith. This is from the video Alex Stein attacked by trans people for Palestine protesters. College protesters are getting violent.
The response on the left, like, you can't blame all of us for what those guys did. And it's like, right, but the problem becomes when non-students are taking up students' space, barring students from entering, there becomes a civil dispute, people are being physically attacked, and now we're like, okay, what are we supposed to do about this?
This response is a non-response. Tim Pool is still arguing for collective punishment, but nothing he said is a justification of why nonviolent protesters should be arrested. His comments are, at best, a dodge. This is one of the real problems with trying to treat someone like Tim Pool as if he's a serious person. He's either unwilling to respond to a critique in any way that's sufficient, or he simply doesn't have the intellectual capacity to engage with a criticism of his position. For someone who speaks so highly about free speech and debate, he doesn't actually participate in it. In the real world, as the demonstrations persisted, violence broke out on the UCLA campus. According to reports from a variety of mainstream outlets, a group of counter-protesters confronted the pro-Palestinian encampment and started attacking them, all while police and campus security looked on and did nothing to mitigate the situation for several hours. Eventually, police did move in, though they decided to clear out the encampment that was attacked and started arresting people within it. Actions that should be very chilling to anyone who even remotely supports the idea of free expression and protest, but as will probably not surprise anyone watching that, that's not the response Tim Pool had. Importantly though, the counter-protesters showing up and violently attacking the pro-Palestinian encampment flies in the face of the narrative Tim Pool is trying to construct, of the demonstrators in the encampment being the violent ones. The counter-protesters were mostly unknown at the time, which is perfect for Tim Pool because it gives him the opportunity to make up a narrative. In the video from May 2nd titled, "Civil Unrest at UCLA as Anti-Israel Protesters Brawl with Counter-Protesters, Things Getting Worse."
The people who are fighting the pro-Hamas side were just people who were barred from their school by this, leftist communist faction.
Once again, Tim Pool provides no real evidence to support this claim. Looking at an article in the LA Times that was posted on the same day as Tim Pool's video, we can see the challenges in identifying the counter-protesters, and it helpfully includes a few comments from students who were at the encampment. Here's an excerpt from the article. Jenna, a 21-year-old UCLA student, said that before things turned violent, a group of about 10 people showed up, all wearing white masks, an action she believed was definitely coordinated. At about 11 p.m., she said black trucks pulled up, older men came out and a huge mob started heading toward the encampment. This certainly doesn't sound like a group of students who were simply upset they couldn't go to class. Another example of violence towards the demonstrators was in Portland, Oregon, where we saw an attempted car attack. Thankfully, none of the demonstrators were hurt, and in spite of tweets to the contrary from various right-wing figures, this driver clearly intended to do some malicious harm, as the driver came armed with bear spray, had his license plates covered, and was driving onto a walkway clearly not designed for cars. This incident did not get mentioned in any of the clips I reference in this video. Another major problem is that Tim Pool is completely out of his depth talking about the conflict in Gaza. He seems to think all this anger is about something that happened in the distant past.
And now you have these claims by these Palestinians that, like, that land was once mine 100 years ago. Dude, look.
The occupation did begin nearly 100 years ago, but it's been a continuing process in the decades that followed. Settlements have been used to expand the territory controlled by Israel for decades. We aren't talking about people who lost their homes 100 years ago. The Palestinians have been losing their homes and land for decades. This is all very recent history, and it's embarrassing that Tim Pool doesn't seem to know this at all. In another video, this one from me, called Arrests and Less Lethal, Rounds Fired at Pro-Hamas UCLA Protest, House Says Criticizing Israel Illegal, Tim Pool refers to Israel's formation as a conquest.
When you look at the politics of the region, you have war. Israel is a country. It exists. People don't like it because Israel's formation is in the past 100 years or whatever. And I'm like, don't care.
Whenever the history of this topic comes up, this is his usual line. He doesn't really care, but will instead make vague gestures as if he has the faintest clue. Not caring about a topic is fine. You don't have to care about everything. But if you don't care about a topic, perhaps Tim Pool could simply not speak about it, especially if he can't be bothered to do any research on it whatsoever. Though he has to present a pretext of understanding any of this so he can get to his real business of criticizing the demonstrators, who he ironically accuses of knowing nothing about the issue when he's obviously not in a position to judge that. Here's another example of Tim simply not understanding this topic.
They were launching like a Unite for Israel protest. Mm-hmm. And she was like, they're cheering on the anti-Semitism because it's a sign of the end times or something. And I'm like, I am so confused. The people who are pro-Israel are Nazi anti-Semites?
Evangelical Christians have long been supporters of Israel because, in their minds, Israel's existence is crucial to fulfilling a prophecy that will lead to the end times and the return of Jesus Christ. A prophecy that also involves any Jewish person who doesn't convert to Christianity dying. It's a movement called Christian Zionism, and his ignorance is another example of how unsuited he is to address this at even a basic level. Another annoying part of Tim Pool's commentary is how he just casually drops in lies about easily verifiable facts. Here's a lie Tim Pool tells about Trump supporters.
These protests, and they're literally calling for murder, literally. There's a challenge. The left claims that people on the right are. They're not. Like, I go to a Trump rally, and nobody is.
I can think of at least one famous example where Trump supporters were calling for murder.
You politicians are going to get drugged through the streets. Yeah.
And you might be noticing a pattern with all these deceptions. While it would be wrong to describe Tim Pool as a Republican partisan, as he will occasionally argue against certain elements within that party, it's very clear that he will fawn over Donald Trump.
I can only tell you this. Joe Biden's not the right answer. And our best bet right now is going to be Donald Trump. Why? He's going to improve the economy. We're going to see better numbers. We're going to see a more secure border. It's going to be better for your future. And I'm not saying it's going to be perfect. Certainly not. But it'll be better.
That more or less speaks for itself. Tim Pool really likes Donald Trump. And while Trump isn't a major figure in this story about demonstrators, when in doubt, Tim is always happy to throw some random love to Trump. It's his version of buying a vowel. There was an example where Tim Pool did disagree with Donald Trump, though, and it regarded a bill that expanded the definition of anti-Semitism that had recently passed in Congress. Although, as you might have expected, rather than wag his finger or get enraged at Donald Trump supporting a bill that curtailed free expression, he simply noted the disagreement and quickly moved on. But I want to talk about this particular bill because it's a rare example of Tim Pool coming down on the better side of an issue. In a statement about the bill, the ACLU described it saying, "It would likely chill free speech of students on college campuses by incorrectly equating criticism of the Israeli government with anti-Semitism." While this seems like the rare opportunity to argue on the same side as Tim Pool, the problem with that is Tim Pool simply isn't an ally worth having. While opposition to this bill is welcome, the problem is that in his opposition, Tim Pool will then justify some pretty grotesque comments from Matt Gaetz. This is Tim's commentary about an article from Politico that pointed out how Gaetz used an anti-Semitic trope about the Jewish people being responsible for the death of Jesus Christ.
Claims that Jews are responsible for the execution of Jesus by Roman authorities have long been regarded as an anti-Semitic trope and rejected by historians and theologians. That is one of the most insane things I have ever seen, because this is quite literally the story of the Passion of the Christ.
Although none of this should be understood as me defending the bill at all, what's being misunderstood here is not about the supposed history presented in the Bible of specific Jewish people being responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. Rather, it's about this very real historical phenomena of the Jewish people being collectively blamed for the death of Jesus Christ. This has been used as a justification for centuries of persecution of the Jewish people, and it includes numerous atrocities that have been committed against them. This is some basic history on the subject, and pretending that this is simply a reading of scripture and nothing more is providing cover for a very well-known anti-Semitic trope. Of all the ways to critique this bill, Tim Pool goes with the way that provides cover for an anti-Semitic talking point. This is why he's not an ally worth having. Before wrapping up this video, though, I want to take a quick break and point out how silly Tim's commentary also is. He can never help himself, and he insists on making ridiculous comparisons to movies and TV shows. For example, this hypothetical is just the opening scene from the Three Body Problem TV series.
And they're going to be wearing ridiculous clothing, and they're going to bring former officials up with dunce caps on, and they're going to mercilessly beat them in front of a cheering and screaming crowd. People need to understand that things like the Culture Revolution happen just with critical mass.
And he lets us know that he's watched a few other shows.
We are now facing what I refer to as, and thanks to the Fallout IP, the enclave. If those decisions ultimately are detrimental to this country, so be it. We made our choices as we're allowed. I was watching that show Invincible. Apparently I watch a lot of Amazon shows.
And I simply can't move on without pointing out this deeply ironic statement.
It's people. I don't think people understand. They live in a world of movies and video games, and it's kind of wild to think about.
Also, this is just a random clip I found where he seems to think police keep bears off the street.
When bears are roaming the city streets because there's no police anymore.
Everyone, of course, knows it's the Bear Patrol that keeps our streets bear-free. And here's a quick quiz for anyone watching. I'm going to play you a clip and see if you can guess what the title of this video is.
Typically, when I get a male comedian, it sometimes could be about relationships, but it's typically about some issue, like something in life. It could be, what's the deal with airline food, like airline food issues. Mm-hmm. I would say every single female comedian is talking about having sex with a guy.
The title is Cops Arrest Unhinged Professor at Emory University. She doesn't understand consequences. This is what it's like watching Tim Pool's videos, though. This video you're watching right now is my attempt to make sense of the conversations and commentaries that are fueled by digressions and ignorance, making sense of commentary that is absolute clutter. And that's exactly why I want to highlight Tim Pool specifically when it comes to the response to these demonstrators. Not just because he repeats the same lies and distortions you would find on an episode of Morning Joe, but he does it in a way that's not just about misinforming people, but also nullifies any sort of higher understanding of anything. The demonstrators aren't meant to be understood, just mocked and disregarded. Tim Pool has a very long history of delegitimizing political demonstrations. I pointed out an example myself in an earlier video a few years back when he lied about the death of a demonstrator named Summer Taylor, blaming them for getting hit by a car that illegally entered a closed highway and recklessly drove through a demonstration. For all of Tim Pool's commentary talking about his support of free speech, that's really just a cover for demonizing the left, hiding their intentions, and normalizing violence against them. It's not very difficult to find examples of right-wing demonstrations that have turned violent. There's the obvious example of January 6th, but we also saw violence at Charlottesville or the armed ranchers led by Cliven Bundy who seized a government building. The actions of these individuals doesn't mean that right-wing voices should be forbidden from ever holding demonstrations or protests. Because, unlike Tim Pool, I don't believe in collective punishment, and I don't think a larger group's rights should be suspended because of the actions of a few. One point of unity that could have been found here is how Tim Pool, to his slight credit, doesn't like the idea of the United States sending money to Israel. He extends this to all other nations, regardless of context, because he's not a careful thinker. But even so, he could at least provide nominal support for demonstrators clearly trying to get American money out of Israel. Instead, he cheers on police as they crack down on those who oppose an ongoing genocide. Those more familiar with my channel will probably be aware that I've made a few passing references to the ongoing genocide in Gaza in the past, but I haven't dedicated an entire video on the subject because I wasn't sure how I could approach it in a way that was constructive or helpful. I thought this particular angle would provide a type of commentary where I can use my existing knowledge and skill set to some degree of support for voices who are trying to stop any aid to the Israeli government as it continues its genocide of the Palestinian people. I would also like to briefly say to any of the students who are demonstrating for the Palestinian people, I am deeply impressed with the level of passion and commitment for a cause that has very little support within the mainstream and faces serious violent response from the state and counter-protesters. Demonstrations like these matter because the lives of Palestinians matter. And I hope this signals a shift in the coming generations of an acknowledgement for their human rights. Thank you all so much for watching.